Let me throw a theory at you to start things off today.
Okay, I am listening.
So usually when you and I talk about a city's history, whether it's, Seattle or New York or Chicago, we tend to look at the big permanent things.
Right, the physical stuff.
Exactly. The architecture, the suspension bridges, the massive corporate headquarters, or the towering skyscrapers. We just naturally expect history to be rooted in concrete and steel.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's tangible.
Right. But then you look at something like a city's local comedy scene, and suddenly you realize you aren't looking at concrete at all. You're looking at a fault line. You're basically building a house on tectonic plates that are just constantly shifting underneath you.
Oh, I love that analogy. It is the absolute definition of a landscape in perpetual motion.
Yeah.
Because unlike a skyscraper, a comedy scene doesn't stay put. It is entirely dependent on the invisible pressures of the city around it, like real estate prices, demographic shifts, the local economy.
All the stuff going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. All of these things dictate who is actually allowed to tell a joke and where they are allowed to tell it.
And that brings us to our mission for today. So welcome, everyone. If you're listening to this deep dive right now and you've ever paid like $20 to sit in a dark basement and watch someone try to make you laugh, this one is completely custom tailored for you.
It really is.
We are mapping the fault lines of the Seattle comedy scene. We're going to trace its turbulent history, starting from the golden eras of local television, moving through these crazy underground cultural civil wars, right up to the massive post-COVID comedy empires that are basically redrawing the map today.
And to do this properly, to really get under the hood, we had to dig deep into the archives.
Oh, yeah. We went digging.
We aren't just looking at a simple timeline here. We are looking at the actual mechanics of an art form.
Right, which means we're pulling from literally everywhere. We've got decades of historical reporting from The Stranger in Seattle Met. We're digging into the old broadcast archives of legendary local television shows.
Some really wild stuff in there.
For sure. And we found these brutally honest exit interviews from comedians who packed up and fled the city. Plus, modern podcast transcripts, YouTube commentaries, club manifestos. We are putting all of these pieces on the table to figure out how a city's cultural identity directly shapes its sense of humor.
What's really fascinating when you review all this material is that a very clear narrative emerges. It's a story about economics, honestly, just as much as it's about art.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about how the rent you pay directly influences the punchline you deliver.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you really want a shortcut to being deeply well-informed about how local art survives in a changing American city, we kind of have to start by looking at a time before the internet globalized everything.
We have to go back to the 1980s.
Right. The 1980s, during this incredibly rare golden age of local television. Specifically, we have to talk about a sketch comedy show produced by the local NBC affiliate, King TV. It was called Almost Live.
Almost Live is such a crucial starting point. I mean, it breaks all the rules of modern media economics.
It really does.
It ran from 1984 all the way to 1999. It originally started as a weekly half-hour talk and comedy sketch show hosted by Ross Schaefer. It was patterned heavily after Late Night with David Letterman, actually.
Okay, but then the pivot happens, right?
Exactly. The pivot happens in 1989 when John Keister takes over as host. They dropped the guest interviews, they dropped the live bands, and they shifted entirely to just sketch comedy.
And here is where the mechanics of television at the time get so wild. The show became so incredibly popular in the Pacific Northwest that King TV actually went to NBC executives and asked for permission to broadcast Almost Live at 11:30 p.m. on Saturday nights.
Which, I mean, for anyone who knows television programming, that is the most fiercely guarded time slot in comedy.
Because it's SNL.
That is the time slot for Saturday Night Live.
Wait, I have to stop you there, because how does a local affiliate get away with that? How do they economically justify pushing SNL, Lorne Michaels, literally the biggest comedy institution in the world, back to midnight just to air local guys making regional jokes? Didn't the network fight them tooth and nail on that?
Well, they absolutely would have fought them in any other market, but you have to look at the local ratings.
Ah, right. Follow the money.
Always. Keister himself noted that SNL was actually tanking in the Seattle market at that specific time, whereas Almost Live was this absolute juggernaut-winning major regional Emmy Awards.
Wow.
The local ad revenue for Almost Live was straight up outperforming the national ad revenue for SNL. So NBC just let them keep the time slot indefinitely.
That is insane.
They bumped Lorne Michaels for local sketch comedy simply because the hyper-local focus created a completely captive audience.
And when we say hyper-local, we mean hyper-local. I mean, if you lived in Seattle, this show was a shared inside joke for an entire metropolitan area.
Yeah.
The writers didn't care if someone in Ohio wouldn't understand the joke. They routinely roasted specific Seattle neighborhoods. Our sources mention how they would target Ballard, which at the time was known predominantly as the home of elderly Scandinavian Americans.
Right, right.
And the running joke was that you'd see these massive old cars parked halfway onto the sidewalks with their seatbelts just slammed in the doors.
They also relentlessly targeted Fremont and Wallingford. They characterized those neighborhoods as the epicenters for aging, middle-aged hippies and new agers who were just holding on to the 60s.
Right, and the suburbs got it even worse. If you were from Bellevue or Mercer Island, the show portrayed you as an out-of-touch, upscale snob.
Naturally.
And if you were from Kent or Renton, you were perceived by the show's young urban writers as low-income and blue-collar. They even went after cities 2 hours away, like Olympia and Bellingham, playing on all their pothead stereotypes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to understand why this worked so well. Before social media allowed us to build digital communities based on niche interests, your community was strictly geographical.
Yeah, your physical neighbors.
Exactly. Almost Live functioned as a mirror. By keeping the satire so ruthlessly specific, the show created an incredibly tight-knit cultural identity. It basically told the people of the Pacific Northwest, we see you, we know your exact quirks, and we are all in on this joke together.
And the sketches themselves are legendary. You had Cops In, which was a brilliant parody of the raw, shaky cam style of the TV show Cops. But they set it in the specific Seattle neighborhoods.
Oh, I've seen clips of this. It's great.
So instead of arresting violent criminals, the police would aggressively tackle an elderly woman in Ballard for driving like 5 miles an hour under the speed limit.
And they had a recurring bit called the high-fiving white guys. It was just a group of excessively exuberant, young, middle-class, Caucasian males wearing polo shirts with zero self-awareness, running around the city giving each other high fives over absolutely nothing.
The joke was just the sheer unwarranted confidence of mundane existence.
But the sketch that truly captured the zeitgeist of Seattle at that exact moment was The Lame List, which was also known as What's Weak This Week.
Oh man, this one is a masterclass in contrasting tones. Okay, so Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s was the epicenter of the grunge music explosion.
Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all of it.
Slacker culture, flannel, heavy metal, it was taking over the world. So the writers of Almost Live got real members of Seattle's intimidating heavy metal and grunge community, guys like Kim Thayil, the lead guitarist of Soundgarden, and members of thrash metal bands like Bitter End and Forced Entry.
Well, heavy hitters.
Yeah. And these terrifyingly tough-looking musicians would stand in a dark alley, staring aggressively at the camera. The announcer would read a list of hypothetical everyday situations like having a job that starts in the morning or a girlfriend who won't give you beer money. And the metalheads would just violently scream the word lame at the screen.
It's funny on its face, but what really elevated it was the writing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The genius was the pacing. The writers would sneak in one incredibly sophisticated, out-of-place geopolitical hypothetical into the middle of the list. The announcer would say, Eastern European nations shifting to a free market economy, and these angry metalheads would just stare at the camera with blank, bewildered silence for an uncomfortably long time.
Just dead air.
And then the announcer would move on to running out of nachos, and they'd go right back to screaming lame.
It was a perfect encapsulation of the era's attitude. But arguably the most enduring structural legacy of Almost Live isn't a sketch at all. It's a person. This local show actually served as the incubator for a massive national icon.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. This completely blew my mind when we were doing the research.
It's such a great origin story.
Bill Nye was working as an actual aircraft engineer for Boeing, which is obviously a massive employer in Seattle. He was doing some writing and performing on the side. Ross Schaefer, the original host, encouraged Nye to start doing live science demonstrations on the show.
Which is such a wild pivot.
Right. And Nye even developed this bizarre superhero persona on Almost Live called Speedwalker. He fought crime, But he did it while strictly adhering to the ridiculous-looking rules of competitive speed walking. You'd see a purse snatcher running away, and Bill Nye aggressively heel-to-toe walking after him.
The visual alone is hilarious.
But those early science segments actually proved the concept.
Yeah.
It was the testing ground that eventually developed into the Bill Nye, the Science Guy educational TV series that debuted nationally on PBS in 1994 and became an absolute staple for a whole generation of kids.
So you have this incredibly healthy, vibrant local television scene anchoring the cultural humor of the city. But simultaneously, the physical live comedy scene, the brick and mortar clubs, was undergoing a massive, violent economic cycle. We have to talk about the 1980s stand-up club boom.
Right. Let's step away from the TV screen and look at the physical landscape of the city. According to an incredibly detailed retrospective by Brendan Kelly in The Stranger, Seattle was riding the same stand-up comedy wave that was sweeping the entire country.
Yeah, comedy clubs were popping up everywhere.
In the late 80s, Seattle had 4 major, fully operational comedy clubs. You had Giggles, the Comedy Underground, Laughs, and the Improv. People were paying top dollar to see massive touring acts. Our sources mention comedians like Andrew Dice Clay and Gallagher regularly rolling through. The clubs were packed every single weekend. It was an absolute gold rush.
But as with any gold rush, the fundamental laws of supply and demand eventually catch up with you. You have to look at the business model of a 1980s comedy club. It wasn't just about ticket sales. It was heavily reliant on the 2-drink minimum.
Actually, can you explain that mechanism for our listeners who might not be familiar with the club economics of that era? Like, how does a drink minimum dictate the comedy?
It's all about profit margins. Comedy clubs are essentially bars that use comedy as a loss leader to get you in the door. If a club mandates that every single audience member must purchase at least 2 items from the bar, the club's primary goal isn't necessarily to curate high-minded art. It's to turn tables and keep the room full.
Sell the booze.
Right. When the boom was at its peak, the public's demand to just go to a comedy club completely outstripped the actual supply of truly talented, road-tested comedians.
It reminds me of the dot-com bubble.
That's a good comparison.
In the late 90s, venture capitalists were throwing millions at any startup that had a .com in its name, regardless of whether the business actually produced anything useful. In the 80s comedy boom, the venture capital was audience attention. People were throwing their Friday nights at any building with a brick wall and a microphone.
That is a very apt comparison, because what happens when demand outstrips supply? Quality plummets. Club owners and booking agents needed bodies on stages to fill the time slots. So they started pulling inferior talent up from the hacky rank and file.
All the guys who weren't ready.
Exactly. They were taking open mic level comics, guys who maybe had 5 minutes of cheap derivative jokes, and pushing them into headlining spots. They were feeding subpar comedy to the American public just to keep the doors open and the 2-drink minimums flowing.
And the consumer backlash was brutal. Because audiences aren't stupid.
Mm-hmm.
They realized they were paying $20 at the door, plus $20 in watered-down cocktails to watch some guy in a blazer make terrible airplane food jokes.
Yeah, the novelty wore off.
They turned their attention elsewhere. Locally, the youth culture pivoted hard into the exploding grunge music scene. Nationally, people realized they could just stay home and watch brilliant, highly polished comedy on TV with the rise of massive sitcoms like Seinfeld. The stand-up format's popularity took a severe nosedive. The bubble burst.
And the physical landscape of Seattle comedy changed immediately. Laughs closed its doors. The Improv folded. The city was suddenly left with only 2 major clubs standing. Giggles, located up north in the University District, and the Comedy Underground, located down south in historic Pioneer Square.
Those 2 clubs essentially retreated into survival mode for the rest of the 90s. They relied on local open mic nights during the week to keep the lights on, and touring headliners on the weekends to pay the rent. They were kept afloat by a small, hardcore comedy following and a demographic of casual patrons who were just looking for a boisterous night out drinking.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the next massive shift. The 80s and 90s established a baseline. They proved what Seattle comedy was and built the physical institutions that survived the crash. But as we move into the 2000s, a generational clash begins to brew. A clash that fundamentally asked what Seattle comedy should be.
Okay, so you have a city where the bubble has burst, and the comedy scene has retreated into these dark, traditional, drink minimum basements. Where does a 22-year-old kid who wants to tell weird, vulnerable stories go?
Not to the basement.
No, they can't survive in that environment. They have to build a new one. This is the era of the frat boys, the coffee shops, and the alternative comedy rebellion.
Let's start by looking at the old guard, the establishment they were rebelling against. The Comedy Underground in Pioneer Square was the premier institution, and to be fair, it had incredible history. This was the exact club that hosted Mitch Hedberg's legendary 1997 comedy contest win.
Which is huge. Anyone in that room knew they were watching a future, once-in-a-generation icon.
But the Comedy Underground had structural issues, and I mean that literally.
Oh, the building itself, yes. Sources like Sean L. McCarthy's The Comics. Comic described the architecture of the building as being almost cartoonishly flawed. It was situated beneath a sports bar called Swannie's. Anyone walking downstairs to the comedy room would immediately notice that the floor and the ceiling didn't form parallel lines.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the building was visibly warped. In fact, in 2008, the club actually had to shut down entirely for a year just to undergo a massive seismic retrofit because the city realized it wasn't safe against earthquakes.
Oh, wow. But the physical structure was only half the problem. The cultural structure of the room was what really alienated the younger comics. Think about the environment. You are in a basement, underneath a popular sports bar. Professional baseball players and their entourages are constantly filtering downstairs after games. The waitstaff is aggressively pushing drink orders.
Recipe for disaster.
It creates a very specific vibe. It was loud, it was boisterous, and it catered to a traditional, sometimes aggressive, bachelor party-style comedy crowd.
I want to share a story from Brendan Calley's reporting that perfectly captures why the younger generation felt they had to escape. Calley interviews veteran comedian Dan Moore, who describes the traditional comedy club crowd of that era as essentially frat boys.
That paints a picture.
Yeah, and Moore tells this incredibly painful story about an open mic night at the Comedy Underground. A guy gets on stage in what Moore calls his frat boy uniform, baseball cap pulled down, very aggressively casual. This comic calls a woman up from the audience to the stage. Out of nowhere, he takes a bottle of water and pours it down the back of her pants.
What? That is insane.
Right. Now, the other comics in the back of the room watching this assume it's a bit. They assume she must be a plant, a friend of his, helping him with a physical comedy routine. But then the panic sets in. They realize she is a complete stranger. It's not a bit, it's just assault masquerading as crowd work. And to make it infinitely worse, the comic then pulls a penny out of his pocket, tosses it into the crowd, and yells a highly offensive anti-Semitic remark.
Good grief. It is a shocking extreme example, but you can see exactly why it acts as an inciting incident for a cultural rebellion. If you are a young artist trying to write clever, nuanced, or vulnerable material, you look at that guy on stage and realize, this is not my industry. This room is actively hostile to what I want to do.
Absolutely.
Moore essentially stated that the entire alternative comedy scene in Seattle was born out of a desperate desire to be the exact opposite of that specific guy on stage.
So in response to this toxic vibe, these young comedians realized they couldn't just write better jokes. They had to change the physical environment. They didn't want to fight for stage time in a basement where the audience was drunk and hostile. Enter a group that brilliantly called themselves the People's Republic of Comedy, or PRO for short.
PRO is a fascinating case study in grassroots arts organizing. It was a collective featuring comedians like Emmett Montgomery, Kevin Hyder, Daniel Carroll, and Scott Moran.
And the origins are so perfectly Seattle. Kevin Hyder actually owned a coffee shop on Capitol Hill, which is the progressive artistic neighborhood of the city, called the People's Republic of Coffee. It was physically attached to a tattoo parlor.
You can't get more Seattle than that.
Emmett Montgomery was a regular customer. They bonded over this shared frustration with the traditional club scene and a mutual desire to do stand-up. They started writing together, performing at local, dingy dive bars, and eventually they created a regular showplace called Laff Hole.
I want to pause here and clarify a piece of industry jargon because it is crucial to understanding this era. We throw around the term alt comedy or alternative comedy a lot, but what does that actually mean?
Good question.
Comedian Hari Kondbolu, who cut his teeth in the Seattle scene before finding massive national success, made a brilliant observation about this. He pointed out that in the early 2000s, alt comedy wasn't necessarily a descriptor of the jokes. It wasn't just a style of telling weird stories. It was literally an alternative venue choice.
Yes. I love this distinction. Alt comedy wasn't an aesthetic. It was an economic pivot. These comics physically moved the art form out of the traditional clubs. They started putting on shows in indie rock music venues like Numos and Chop Suey. They performed in coffee shops. They rented out black box theaters like the Capitol Hill Arts Center.
Let's unpack the economics of that pivot. When you change the venue, you fundamentally change the audience expectations. In a traditional club, the ticket is $15 or $20, plus a mandatory 2-drink minimum. The audience feels financially invested, and therefore, they demand immediate, rapid-fire punchlines to get their money's worth.
They want laughs per minute.
Right. But in an indie rock venue, the ticket is $5. There is no drink minimum. The seating is probably folding chairs or just standing room. Because it feels like a DIY music show, it attracts a younger, smarter, more patient demographic.
The pressure is totally off.
Exactly. Suddenly, comedians were free from the tyranny of the setup punchline rhythm. They could tell a 3-minute rambling story without a clear joke in the middle, trusting that the audience would patiently stay with them until the final payoff. It allowed a completely different narrative-driven style of comedy to flourish.
But this shift did not happen peacefully. The establishment did not like seeing talent and audiences siphoned off into coffee shops. We ended up with what our sources describe as a literal comedy Cold War in Seattle.
A turf war.
Yeah. There was massive tension between the old guard club owners and the new alt comedy producers. Terry Taylor, the owner of Giggles up in the U District, famously laid down the law. He banned a very well-loved former MC named Peter Gray from his club entirely. Why? Because Gray had the audacity to start producing a competing Wednesday night alt comedy show called Komedy Night at a music venue called the Mirabeau Room.
Terry Taylor's stance was rigid, and it represents a very traditional, old-school philosophy of stand-up. He essentially argued that alternative comedy was a fake genre.
Just an excuse.
Yeah, he thought it was just a protective label used by people who weren't actually funny enough to get booked in real clubs, so they had to go make their own safe little treehouses. His exact defining quote from the historical reporting is, "There is no alternative to comedy. Funny is funny."
Okay, I have to push back hard on Terry Taylor here, because I don't think funny is funny in a vacuum. The environment completely dictates the laugh.
How do you mean?
Let me ask you this. If you take a brilliant, experimental, long-form storyteller, someone like Mike Birbiglia or Maria Bamford, and you put them on stage in front of a bachelor party at midnight on a Saturday in a sports bar basement, and they bomb horribly, does their failure mean they aren't funny? Or does it just mean they are in the wrong room? I think the PRK guys proved that if you curate the room, you change the definition of what is allowed to be funny.
It's the eternal debate in stand-up, isn't it? The road dog mentality versus the curated artist. A traditional road dog believes that a truly great comedian must have a tight 5. A flawless, battle-tested 5-minute routine that they can perform anywhere in the country, in front of any demographic, under any conditions, and absolutely kill. If you can't do that, the old guard says you aren't a real comic.
Right, but the alt scene argued that standardizes comedy into something boring and universally bland.
Exactly. But to be fair to the traditionalists, it's worth noting that while the underground scene was having this philosophical civil war in coffee shops, the traditional, universally appealing style of comedy was still producing massive local stars who broke onto the national stage.
Which brings us to Jeff Dye. I love this story because he is the perfect example of an early 2000s mainstream breakout who completely bypassed all that alt comedy angst.
He just went straight ahead.
Yeah. Jeff Dye grew up in Kent, Washington. He admits he only went to college because he thought it was what you were supposed to do. He hated it, dropped out, and decided to pursue stand-up comedy with a terrifying singular level of dedication. He didn't care about alt rooms. He went straight to the traditional clubs. He started performing at Giggles, doing sets 7 nights a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a night.
And his style was the antithesis of the dark, experimental alt comedy scene. He describes himself as incredibly laid back. He made a conscious decision to only do clean comedy. He wasn't political, he wasn't profane, and he wasn't trying to push the boundaries of the medium. He just wanted to make the room feel comfortable and happy.
And that universally appealing tight 5 paid off incredibly fast. At just 25 years old, with only 3 years of actual comedy experience, he became the youngest contestant on NBC's reality competition show, Last Comic Standing.
That's a huge launch pad.
Massive. But my favorite part of the research is this incredibly surreal anecdote from his time on the show. As part of a challenge for the TV series, the producers flew Jeff Dye to the Playboy Mansion in Los Angeles.
Which, if you think about it, is a spectacularly intimidating venue for a clean 25-year-old kid from Kent.
It's an absolute nightmare scenario. And the specific challenge was absurd. He had to tell a made-up, improvisational children's bedtime story to Hugh Hefner's 3 girlfriends, the stars of the reality show Girls Next Door. And he had to do it while they were literally sitting in bed in their pajamas.
Ah, fresh.
Dye admits he bombed horribly. He later said it was an impossible psychological balancing act. He realized he didn't want to be too clever or abstract because they might not get the joke and it would fall flat. But he was terrified of being too silly or simplistic because then they would feel insulted that he was treating them like actual toddlers.
Who was got it?
Completely. He got stuck in his own head, paralyzed by the context of the room. He said the comedy was a disaster, but hey, he still got to go back to Kent and brag that he hung out at the Playboy Mansion.
It's a hilarious story, but Jeff Dye's success actually highlights a growing problem in Seattle. He proved that the traditional pipeline to national television was still technically functional, but he was the exception, not the rule. As the 2000s rolled into the 2010s, a harsh structural reality began to set in. Despite the thriving alt-comedy scene and the packed open mics, local comedians were hitting a hard, invisible ceiling.
Which ushers us into the 2010s. If the 2000s were about building new rooms, the 2010s were about realizing those rooms had a glass ceiling. This is the era of the great talent exodus and the rise of the safe space movement.
A really tumultuous time.
Yeah. To really understand why the scene started to fracture, we have to look at a 2013 exit interview from comedian Derek Sheen. Sheen was a respected veteran of the local scene, but he decided to pack up and move to Los Angeles. And as he was leaving, he sat down with City Arts magazine to essentially perform an autopsy on Seattle comedy. And he pulls absolutely no punches.
It is a brutally honest assessment of civic failure. Sheen praises the amazing alt-comedy surge of the 2000s. He lovingly lists all the incredible comics he came up with, guys who went on to write for major television shows and tour nationally. But his critique of the actual infrastructure of the 2013 scene is scathing.
He diagnoses Seattle with a massive, fatal structural problem. Seattle has absolutely no film or television industry, and he places the blame directly on the city's political leadership. He argues that the city council and the mayor's office would rather subsidize massive sports stadiums than offer the tax credits necessary to attract visiting film studios.
The incentives just weren't there.
Right. And he points to Vancouver, British Columbia, just a few hours north across the border, as a glaring example of a city that figured out how to build a billion-dollar film infrastructure.
This is a critical point that listeners need to understand about the entertainment business. Why does a lack of a film industry kill a stand-up comedy scene? The two seem completely unrelated, right? Stand-up is live, film is recorded.
Exactly. You don't need a camera to tell a joke in a basement. So why does it matter?
Because of the economic ecosystem it creates. Sheen explains the domino effect. If a city has no film or TV productions shooting locally, then there is no demand for local talent agents. If there are no talent agents, there is no one to scout the comedy clubs. If there's no one scouting the clubs, there are no actual tangible possibilities for career advancement.
You just hit a wall.
Exactly. Without a robust local industry to offer comedians paid writing gigs, small commercial acting work, or bit parts on television shows to supplement their income, local comedy scenes are permanently relegated to being mere incubators. They become a place where you can learn how to be funny, but once you are funny, you inevitably have to leave for Los Angeles or New York to actually make a living. The city becomes a farm team that constantly loses its best players.
And Sheen pointed out that this specific dynamic, the constant drain of top-tier talent, caused the scene left behind to turn incredibly toxic.
Oh, the infighting.
Oh, yeah. He describes a local community that was mired in petty drama. Because there were no real stakes, no agents to impress, the comics started turning on each other. He talks about toxic, anonymous internet message boards where comics would tear each other down. He talks about a bizarre, back-patting defense of that old fratty behavior we talked about earlier. He describes the creation of tiny, gated comedy communities, little cliques that spent way more time fighting with rival cliques than actually writing good jokes.
It sounds exhausting.
His final warning was chilling. He said that if Seattle didn't pull its head out of its collective behind and fix the infrastructure, it was going to become a comedy hot zone on par with Lansing, Michigan. Just a complete backwater.
It was a massive wake-up call for the artists who remained. While many, like Sheen, chose to accept the reality and leave for greener pastures, a core group of comics chose to stay. And they decided that if Seattle was destined to just be an incubator, they were going to engineer the most supportive, nurturing incubator possible.
Yes, and the absolute pioneer of this movement was Emmett Montgomery, who we mentioned earlier as one of the founders of PRK. By the 2010s, Montgomery had evolved into this beloved, heavily bearded, almost wizard-like stalwart of the scene. He created a monthly showcase at the Annex Theater, which is a fringe theater space, called Weird and Awesome.
And the name really tells you everything you need to know about the curation. Montgomery famously described the show as a safe space to fail and a real great place to succeed. He deliberately, intentionally stripped away the competitive, cutthroat, masculine energy of traditional stand-up.
He flipped the script.
Yeah, in fact, it wasn't even strictly a comedy show. Sometimes people would go up on stage and tell a joke, but sometimes they would go up and read a tragic poem or just cry or share an incredibly strange personal hobby.
The sources highlight a perfect example of this. They mention a local comedian named Allison Lazat, who used her stage time at Weird and Awesome to showcase her haunted dollhouse museum.
That is so wild.
That is not a set-up punchline format. That is hyper-experimental performance art. But Montgomery didn't stop there. He had another regular show called The Magic Hat at a venue called The Rendezvous, and he took this concept of a safe space to an almost psychological extreme.
Yeah.
He would host these events called secret parties. He would take this underground basement venue and plunge it into total pitch-black darkness. No stage lights, no exit signs, nothing. And he would enter the audience into a tontine.
Which is such a bizarrely intellectual premise for a comedy show. A tontine is historically an archaic financial investment scheme where the last surviving member inherits all the money. But Montgomery used it metaphorically, actually referencing an old episode of The Simpsons with Grandpa Simpson and Mr. Burns.
Right.
The idea was that the entire room was entering into a treasure pact. In the pitch black, completely hidden from judgment, he would give the audience 5 minutes to literally shout out their deepest, darkest secrets into the void. It was an exercise in extreme radical vulnerability and community trust.
And this ethos of radical safety spread throughout the city. This was the era that saw the creation of Komedy Womb. This was a heavily curated open mic specifically designed to bring more women, non-binary, and queer performers into stand-up. It pushed back hard against the overwhelming demographic stereotype that comedy was just a sport for, as Montgomery cheekily put it, sad, bearded dudes.
And we have to acknowledge that these spaces were incredibly vital. They diversified the voices on stage. They allowed performers who would have been booed off a traditional club stage in 3 seconds to actually develop their voice over months and years without the crushing pressure of a hostile crowd.
Okay, but here's where I want to introduce a theory, and I want your take on it.
Yeah.
I look at these incredibly supportive, inclusive, safe spaces, and I think of them like a greenhouse.
Okay, a greenhouse.
If you build a greenhouse, you can grow the most rare, beautiful, strange, delicate orchids in the world. And that's what these weird comics were. But the fundamental problem with a greenhouse is, what happens when you take that delicate orchid and you plant it outside in the freezing Ohio winter? It dies immediately.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Did creating these hyper-insulated safe spaces actually help these comics build sustainable careers? Or did it insulate them so much from the harsh, aggressive realities of the national touring circuit that Derek Sheen was warning about that they became completely unmookable outside of their own zip code? If you spend 5 years performing in a pitch-black room where the audience is mandated to applaud your vulnerability, what happens when you finally—
But more importantly for our timeline, this hyper-curated, highly progressive greenhouse environment perfectly set the stage for the explosive culture wars that were about to tear the scene apart right after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Which brings us into the modern era, the 2020s. This is the era of post-COVID closures, national culture wars playing out on local stages, and the rise of massive suburban comedy empires.
The landscape shifts again.
Big time. To really set the mood for where Seattle was at the start of the 2020s, you just have to look at the title of a recent podcast episode released by local comedian Mike Masalotti. The episode was bluntly, definitively titled, "The Comedy Underground is Dead."
Wow. It was the literal and metaphorical end of an era. The old guard institutions were fading or closing entirely, and the city as a whole was desperately struggling to recover its cultural footing after the devastating pandemic lockdowns. But, nature abhors a vacuum. Into this massive void stepped a brand new venue in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It was called Komedy Bar, and it was founded in 2023 by 2 local comedians, Dane Hesseldahl and Jess Anderson.
Now, context is everything here. Capitol Hill is widely known as the progressive, LGBTQ+, deeply artistic heart of Seattle. But ironically, for a neighborhood that loved the arts, it had historically been somewhat of a comedy desert when it came to dedicated full-time brick-and-mortar clubs.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot there.
So Komedy Bar moved into a legendary local space that used to be the Club Lagoon. And initially, it was an immediate, beautiful success story. They hosted hit nights like Queers to the Front, they embraced the indie spirit of the area, and they really synced up with the neighborhood's progressive ethos.
But then they made a booking decision that turned them into the epicenter of a massive, nasty national controversy. Komedy Bar booked a weekend featuring 4 prominent national touring comedians: Dave Smith, Kurt Metzger, Jim Florentine, and Louis J. Gomez.
Yeah, that was a huge deal.
If you follow stand-up, you know these names. These are comics closely associated with the Legion of Skanks podcast universe. They are fiercely known for a very specific brand of edgy, anti-PC, unapologetically offensive, boundary-pushing humor.
And almost immediately after the club announced the booking, the backlash began. The club started receiving a barrage of complaints from local Capitol Hill residents and community activists about the comedians' content, their podcast personas, and their past statements. The pressure mounted quickly, and in response to that intense community outcry, Hesseldahl and Anderson made the call to abruptly cancel all 4 comics.
It was a very swift decision.
Now, whenever you touch a story about a club canceling comics for being anti-PC, you are stepping on a cultural landmine. So for you listening, I want to make our parameters very clear. Our goal here today is not to tell you who was right or who was wrong in this fight. We don't have a horse in this race, and we aren't here to preach.
Right, we're just looking at the facts.
Exactly. What we do care about and what we want to examine is the mechanism. We want to look at how a localized neighborhood booking dispute in Seattle instantly ignited a proxy battle for a massive national culture war.
Exactly. We are acting as observers of the fallout, because the reaction was incredibly polarizing and immediate. On one side of the divide, you had massive national pushback from the comedy industry establishment. Prominent platforms like the Comedy Cellar podcast broadcasting out of New York, and influential YouTube commentators like the Comedy Historian heavily targeted and criticized Komedy Bar.
They went hard after them.
They did. Their argument was rooted in free speech absolutism. They argued that the club was abandoning the fundamental sacred principle of stand-up comedy, which is that the stage must be a place where anything can be said. And instead, they were bowing to the far-left political pressures of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. The national narrative framed it as a cowardly betrayal of the art form.
Conversely, the club, its owners, and its local supporters viewed the cancellation through a completely different lens. From their perspective, this had nothing to do with censorship. It had everything to do with community standards.
A different set of rules.
Right. Local outlets like The Stranger reported on the incident with the viewpoint that the club was completely justified. The argument was that if you open a space in a deeply progressive, marginalized neighborhood, you have a responsibility to that neighborhood. They saw removing regressive and anti-woke acts not as an attack on free speech, but as responsible, necessary curation of a community space. They argued that freedom of speech doesn't mean you are entitled to a microphone in someone else's living room. Yeah.
And, again, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, the incident proved a massive point about modern entertainment. Booking a comedy show in the 2020s is no longer just a financial transaction about selling tickets and turning a profit. It is inherently, unavoidably, a political act.
But here's the ultimate irony. While the internet was waging a fierce philosophical culture war over the soul of Komedy Bar, a much more traditional, ruthless threat was looming over the club in the real world. The brutal, unforgiving reality of Seattle commercial real estate.
It's the Gwen Guthrie rule. Ain't nothing going on but the rent.
Exactly. Hesseldahl explained in interviews that when they originally signed their lease in 2023, the city was still very much recovering from the lockdown. Commercial spaces were empty, landlords were desperate, so they managed to secure an affordable, but notably short, 2-year lease.
Short leases are dangerous.
Very. But as that lease neared its end, the local economy had bounced back. The landlord informed them of a massive, crippling rent hike. And this hike had absolutely no relationship to the club's actual profit margins or ticket sales. It was just the market rate of Capitol Hill real estate adjusting upward. The cultural wars didn't kill them. The rent did. They were facing total closure.
But then we get a massive plot twist. Right at the 11th hour, they were saved by mysterious investors.
I love this part. 2 anonymous investors who reportedly have deep ties to the comedy industry and, crucially, very deep pockets, stepped in to offer a financial lifeline to save the space.
But the rescue money came with major sweeping strings attached. The investors demanded significant structural and branding changes. First, the name Komedy Bar was completely scrapped. As of April 2025, the venue is being reborn and reopening as the Emerald City Comedy Club.
A completely fresh start.
Second, they are massively expanding the physical footprint of the club. They negotiated to take over the entire floor of the building, expanding from a cozy, intimate 100-seat room into a massive 275-seat venue.
Let's talk about why that number, 275 seats, is so important. Hesseldahl noted this expansion will officially make the Emerald City Comedy Club the largest dedicated, full-time comedy venue within Seattle city limits.
It changes the game.
It really does. If you are trying to book a massive national touring comedian, someone with a Netflix special or a huge podcast following, they aren't going to play a 100-seat room. The math just doesn't work for their guarantee. Historically, those acts would bypass the clubs entirely and play large, impersonal theaters in Seattle, like the Neptune or the Moore. By expanding to 275 seats, Emerald City is trying to change the routing map. They want to offer these massive acts a space that actually feels like a comedy club, but has the capacity to pay them what they are worth.
It is a massive roll of the dice in a very expensive city. But while Seattle proper is battling over astronomical rent hikes, neighborhood culture wars, and investor buyouts, a completely different, wildly successful narrative is unfolding just a few miles down the I-5 highway. We absolutely have to talk about the Tacoma Giant.
Oh, this might be my favorite story in the entire deep dive. Because while downtown Seattle was struggling to figure out its identity, a comedian named Nate Jackson was quietly building an absolute empire down south in Tacoma.
He really was.
If you don't know Nate Jackson, he is a wildly successful, incredibly charismatic comedian. You've probably seen him on television. He's been on HBO's Def Comedy Jam, MTV's Wild and Out. He's everywhere. And for a decade, he'd been running a very popular grassroots local showcase called The Super Funny Show.
Building his base.
Yeah. But in 2020, right in the teeth of global uncertainty, he took a massive leap of faith and opened a permanent brick-and-mortar club called Nate Jackson's Super Funny Comedy Club.
And we need to underline the historical significance of this. When Nate Jackson opened those doors, it became the very first Black-owned comedy club in the history of the Pacific Northwest.
That alone is incredible. But he didn't just open a room. He fundamentally changed the standard for what a comedy club should look like in the region. He built a state-of-the-art premium entertainment destination.
First class all the way.
Exactly. He secured prime real estate located right in the heart of downtown Tacoma, situated underneath the Courtyard Marriott. The club features high-tech media capabilities, flawless sound and lighting design, a superior food menu that rivals high-end restaurants, and a management and waitstaff that are aggressively dedicated to a premium customer experience. Because of the sheer quality of the venue, combined with Jackson's deep industry connections and respect among his peers, he is pulling in massive national headliners that Seattle clubs can only dream of.
If we look at the sociological mechanics here, what we are really witnessing with Nate Jackson's success is the geographic decentralization of local comedy.
Unpack that a bit.
Sure. For decades, the unquestioned assumption in the entertainment industry was that to see world-class comedy, or to be a world-class comedian, you had to be located in the dense, expensive downtown core of a major Tier 1 city like Seattle, Chicago, or New York. Nate Jackson proved that the old logic is dead. He proved that the suburbs and the neighboring secondary cities are now entirely capable of building ultra-modern entertainment empires that completely rival and in many ways financially and culturally surpass the historical downtown institutions.
It fundamentally rewrites the map. You don't have to fight for parking in downtown Seattle to see the best comics in the world anymore. You drive to Tacoma.
Exactly.
But through all this turmoil, through the boom and bust of the 80s, the alt-comedy coffeehouse wars, the mass exodus of talent to LA, the culture war cancellations, and the shifting geography of the clubs, you might be listening to this and wondering, is the Pacific Northwest still actually capable of producing top-tier, undeniable local talent? Or is it just a place for touring acts to visit? Are there still comics breaking out of this chaotic local ecosystem?
And despite all the structural challenges we've discussed, the answer is a resounding, undeniable yes.
To prove it, we just need to look at a guy named Sam Miller. Sam is a native of Olympia, Washington, and visually he commands a room before he even speaks. He's 6'6", 360 pounds. But his life story is what truly sets him apart. He is a recovering addict with over 15 years of hard-fought sobriety. And instead of hiding that past, he mines it. He turns personal tragedy into some of the most brilliant, vulnerable, and explosively hilarious stand-up you will ever hear.
His material is a masterclass in the mechanics of tension and release. He takes subject matter that should make an audience incredibly uncomfortable, and he diffuses it with radical honesty.
Our sources pull some amazing specific details from his sets. He does these long routines about the harsh realities of what the county jails in Yakima, Washington are really like, turning incredibly bleak situations into universal laughs.
I love that.
He talks about the bizarre challenges of navigating dating and homelessness early in his sobriety. He has this great observation where he notes how mathematically impossible it is to convince a nice middle-class lady to come back and join you under a tarp in the woods.
It's so dark but so funny.
He talks about the sheer absurdity of his past decisions while under the influence. Like the fact that he went out and had the words, "Let's dance," tattooed in massive letters across his giant belly, despite the fact that he, to this day, absolutely hates dancing.
That is just a perfect image.
But my favorite bit of his is when he uses this incredibly vivid, slightly horrifying imagery to describe the sheer terrifying awe of childbirth from a father's perspective. He compares witnessing his wife give birth to his child to watching a cheeseburger give birth to a hot dog.
Which is a deeply visceral metaphor. It's grotesque, but you instantly understand the profound confusion he was feeling in that hospital room.
Exactly. His wife apparently hates that joke, but audiences absolutely devour it.
Yeah.
And the industry is taking notice. It's working. Sam Miller's debut comedy album, titled Round Trip, shot straight to #1 on the iTunes comedy charts. He was the runner-up in the highly competitive 2021 Seattle International Comedy Competition. He is currently out touring nationally.
He's doing the work.
He is walking proof that despite all the structural chaos of the Seattle scene, the lack of a film industry, the warped floors, the changing leases, the pipeline from a local gritty open mic to national success is still functioning.
It is a profound testament to the resilience of the art form itself. When the structure fails, the talent somehow finds a crack in the concrete to grow through.
So after tracing this entire journey, what does this all actually mean for you listening right now?
Yeah, let's tie together.
Whether you are a Seattle local trying to catch up on the hidden pop culture history of your city, or you are just someone fascinated by how the entertainment industry works under the hood, understanding a comedy scene means understanding how art survives in a constantly changing environment.
Absolutely.
This isn't just a story about jokes. It is a story about the brutal, unforgiving economics of commercial real estate. It's a story about shifting cultural values and how a community collectively decides what is acceptable to laugh at in any given decade. But above all, it is a story about the relentless, stubborn, almost irrational desire of human beings to stand on a brightly lit stage and make strangers laugh, regardless of whether the floor beneath them is warped, or the rent is astronomically high, or the city is gentrifying around them.
It's the human element constantly fighting against the structural elements. But as we wrap this up, this raises one final incredibly important question, and it's something I want to leave you with today.
All right, lay it on us.
As we look toward the future of comedy, we have to acknowledge the massive digital elephant in the room, the internet. With the explosive rise of TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram Reels, digital platforms where comedians can now entirely bypass the club system, ignore the talent agents, and build massive, dedicated, global audiences straight from their bedrooms. Does the concept of a local comedy scene even matter anymore?
Oh, that is a big question.
If a kid in Kent or Olympia can go globally viral with a ring light and a front-facing camera, will these fierce geographical turf wars between Capitol Hill, the U District, and Tacoma eventually just become a quaint thing of the past? Are we currently watching the last days of geographical comedy?
That is a phenomenal, terrifying question to end on. It completely reframes everything we just talked about. It's definitely something for you to mull over the next time you are scrolling endlessly through comedy clips on your phone. Or better yet, the next time you actually leave your house and buy a ticket to a live show in your own hometown to support the artist making art in your zip code. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning the systems and the world around you, and we will see you next time.